Ex-girlfriend of Diddy Combs, testifying under the pseudonym Jane. This witness told the jury yesterday that Combs physically abused her and forced her to take part in drug-fueled hotel nights.
It was supposed to be a sober party, and while that sounds very nice and genuine, she's explained that at this sober party that she had to have sex with 4 escorts in between escort number 3 and escort number 4.
The courtroom
was electric with tension. As Jane took the stand, her voice unsteady, but her words cutting through the silence like a knife in a stunning moment that's now making headlines. Worldwide, she testified under oath about a violent altercation involving Diddy Combs, an incident long buried beneath fame, power, and silence. The moment her statement landed, Diddy visibly lost control, reacting with an intensity that shocked everyone. In the room, gasps echoed through the gallery. The judge immediately called for order, and even security looked uncertain. This wasn't just another celebrity scandal. This was the unraveling of a man once seen as untouchable, and now the world wants to know, what exactly did Jane say that shattered Diddy's composure?
A couple of the witnesses gave false testimony on the stand. Regarding Jane, her testimony, I think what was most striking about it yesterday was how similar some of it was to Cassie Ventura, Sean Combs' ex-girlfriend. In particular, Jane testified about how when Cassie Ventura filed her civil lawsuit in November of 2023, she said that she almost fainted. In fact, she may even have fainted because there were 3 pages of that lawsuit, Errol, where she said it was like word for word reading about her own experience. And she said this to Sean Combs. She couldn't believe how much it mirrored what had happened to her. She also testified about being with Sean Combs when that infamous video of him assaulting Ventura at a hotel came out. She was there when he was crafting his apology. And what was really striking, Errol, is that she then talked about a violent incident that happened with them in June of 2024, after that video had come out.
Telling him about her feelings as far as not doing it and throwing up after one particular hotel night or debauchery night or freak-off party where it was supposed to be a sober party. And while that sounds very nice and genuine, she's explained that at this sober party that she had to have sex with 4 escorts in between escort number 3 and escort number 4.
The courtroom was already tense when Jane was called to the stand, but few could have predicted the ripple effect her testimony would cause. Seated quietly in a navy blazer, with hands folded neatly in her lap, she looked unassuming, almost fragile, but when she began to speak, her words struck like thunder. The first few sentences were calm, almost clinical. She described the timeline of events, her voice unwavering. Despite the gravity of what she was unveiling, it wasn't until she reached the moment of the alleged violent altercation with Diddy Combs that the energy in the courtroom visibly shifted. She paused, inhaled deeply, and then continued, her voice cracked slightly, but she kept going. "He grabbed me," she said, "and slammed me against the wall." Audible gasps filled the room. Diddy, seated just feet away, clenched his jaw. Those closest to him noticed the twitch in his eye, the stiffness in his posture. He gripped the edge of the table as if grounding himself, but it didn't help. Jane went on detailing how the confrontation escalated, how she tried to fight back, how he allegedly shouted obscenities and warned her never to speak of what happened. The accusations were graphic, emotional, and precise. Each sentence peeled back a new layer of a man long protected by celebrity power and decades of influence. Reporters furiously typed notes. Court sketch artist tried to capture the moment. Diddy's composure slipped. His attorney leaned over, whispering something, likely urging restraint. But it was too late. Jane's words had already broken through. His face turned red, and he muttered under his breath. A court officer stood subtly, moving closer to his side. The judge called for a 5-minute recess, sensing the powder keg ready to explode, but the damage was already done. Headlines would soon scream. The news: Diddy loses control in court. Outside the courtroom, crowds gathered. Protesters, fans, media personnel, and curious onlookers filled the courthouse steps. Inside, Jane was ushered away to a secure chamber, her testimony complete, but the consequences only beginning. The prosecution looked satisfied. Diddy's team appeared rattled. This trial was never going to be easy. For years, whispers had circulated about Diddy's alleged misconduct, but no one had ever gone this far in a court of law. No one had ever described in such painful detail what it felt like to be on the other side of his anger. Jane wasn't just a witness. She was a symbol, of something much bigger, a reckoning the music industry already. Reeling from various media allegations and power shifts watched closely. Executives who once aligned themselves with Diddy started to distance themselves. Collaborations were paused. Sponsorships reconsidered. The ripple effects were undeniable in the span of one day. A career built over decades teetered on the edge of collapse.
He threw up, and then Diddy said, okay, well, it's all out of your system, kind of, let's go get back to it. And so we saw more text messages and
that she did not want to engage in these sexual activities with Sean Combs, more specifically with other men in front of Sean Combs, through a series of text messages, and there's voice notes. There's a lot to condense here, and also, as we were talking about, a lot of complicating factors. What were some of the highlights? What do you think are some of the points of her showing, or allegedly showing, she did not want to participate in these sexual activities, these hotel nights, these debauchery nights? What stood out to you?
Yeah, well, a lot of it stood out to me, and it was kind of a slow morning as far as just presenting these mountain of text messages to not only the witness so she could recall everything that she had spoken to with Sean Combs, but also for the jury to kind of understand where I think the prosecution was ultimately leading up to. So, for example, they were showing text exhibits from September 17th of 2023, where Jane was testifying how Diddy was kind of the only one making her perform for her at home, or for him at her home. And she said, I felt like he made such a big purchase, and this was something that I had to do. And that big purchase was her rent, which was about $10,000 a month, and how Diddy kept kind of throwing this in her face. And we see another text exhibit from that same time frame where Jane was saying, I wish we could go back to when we first started dating. I opened Pandora's box and can't close it. One night of fun turned into our entire relationship. I'm crying as I'm writing this. Then you see things like, or not you see, because again, we're not seeing these exhibits. So everything that I'm writing is just transcription from what the prosecution and the witness are kind of going over. So Diddy is replying, girl, stop, let's talk. And then he sends her an audio message. And then you hear Diddy kind of with this raspy voice where he's like, I'm sick in bed. The message that you sent me, what's the problem? We have an actual open relationship. What's the problem? And that Diddy never talked with Jane about her doing these hotel nights in the particular audio message when she was kind of telling her.
Meanwhile, court documents revealed even more. Jane wasn't the only one. Other women, some anonymous, had submitted written testimony. Some were waiting to be called the narrative. Emerging was troubling to say the least. Patterns of aggression, control, and manipulation. Diddy's legal team dismissed the allegations as attempts to smear his name, but the optics were not in their favor. Social media exploded. Hashtags trended worldwide. Diddy trial. Shot justice for Jane. Shot accountability in music. People debated every angle. Was this the fall of an icon or an orchestrated takedown? Public's opinion was divided, but interest was universal. Every detail became a headline. Every pause in court, a moment of speculation as the trial continued. More explosive details surfaced. Video footage was submitted, grainy, time-stamped, but chilling. It showed a heated exchange in a hotel hallway ending with a forceful shove. The footage alone wasn't conclusive, but combined with Jane's testimony, it painted a damning picture. One security guard subpoenaed to testify described Diddy as volatile during private events. Another assistant mentioned moments where he would disappear for hours, returning with bloodshot eyes and a short temper. None of it was directly tied to Jane's claims, but the puzzle pieces were aligning in a way the defense couldn't ignore. Diddy's demeanor in court began to change. Gone was the confident, untouchable mogul who walked in on day one. In his place was Eamon, who appeared increasingly burdened by stress, by fear, by the weight of decades potentially unraveling his eyes. Darted more, he whispered more frequently. To his attorneys, his responses when called to the stand were guarded, clipped, sometimes evasive. The prosecution painted a clear narrative, a powerful man shielded by fame and money, now being held accountable for abuses long ignored. The defense countered with questions of credibility, motive, and timing. They highlighted Jane's past, her financial troubles, her prior relationships, but the more they tried to undermine her, the more sympathy she seemed to gain as the days wore on. Jane became a figure of resilience. People waited outside the courthouse hoping for a glimpse. Some called her brave, others called her Aliyar, but she remained stoic, silent, except for what she said on the record. Her attorneys refused interviews. She didn't post to social media. She didn't seek the spotlight. Yet she was undeniably in it in a particularly gripping moment. A former bodyguard of Diddy's took the stand. What he revealed sent murmurs through the room, a secret room in one of Did's homes, soundproofed, locked from the outside. He claimed he was once told never to let anyone near it. The implication was horrifying. Diddy's attorneys immediately objected, and the judge instructed the jury to disregard it, but the seed had been planted. Questions mounted. What was Diddy hiding? And why were so many people willing to protect him for so long?
In reference to one particular trip in September of 2023, where Diddy told her that he wanted to just take her to New York. They would spend some time together. Jane had thought that, okay, we are going to spend some time together. It's going to be a nice time. She was sending him places for them to go, as far as restaurants to go to here in the city. But she was also kind of texting him some explicit things, such as, for example, Diddy was saying, okay, let's have a good time. Do you have your passport? And then Jane is responding, miss my pretty hard D. Yes, I have my passport, baby. You turned me on so crazy, can't wait. And Jane was saying that Diddy texted her on the flight, and at this point she got particularly upset because Diddy was asking her where Cabral is, and Cabral was one of the escorts that they used. And so Diddy, again, Jane thinking at the time she was flying over to New York for just spending time with her boyfriend, and she was saying that Diddy was wanting an entertainer for that night, or entertainment for movie night. And movie night wasn't going to AMC theaters, which I personally love to do, but movie night was them watching their sexually explicit videos together and their recordings together of these freak off nights. And so Diddy was saying, Jane was saying, I just remember taking deep breaths and feeling disappointed and defeated. And so Jane responded in this particular message, just got to Wi-Fi again, not sure, baby, in response to whether or not Cabral could fly into New York, because Cabral was somebody that was that resided in Atlanta. And so Diddy said, check red phone. Okay, I have a surprise if that's okay, and just one. And so Jane was saying that Diddy was going to introduce her to someone new. And so that she said that she hated it. She hated this entire concept, and she's getting pretty emotional while she's on the witness stand, kind of recalling that, again, she thought that the two were just going to go for a date night. She was going to enjoy her trip to New York City, and then it ended up being another situation where she had to participate in a hotel night. And so
Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, the story took on a life of its own. Protesters gathered daily, some in support of Jane, others insisting on due process signs, rejustice over fame, and we believe her major streaming platforms quietly began removing Diddy. Related content from promotional rotations. One brand suspended a multi-million-dollar campaign. Featuring his music, the impact reached far beyond the courtroom. A surprise development came when another woman under the alias Lisa agreed to testify. Her account was eerily similar to Jane's. She had never met Jane, never spoken to her, but described a night that followed the same pattern: anger, violence, and a chilling warning to stay silent. Her voice cracked as she spoke, but she too finished her testimony. Another crack in the dam. Legal analysts speculated that Diddy's empire might never recover, no matter the verdict. His record label faced lawsuits of its own. Artists began demanding audits and contractual reviews. Behind closed doors, boardrooms were in panic. Diddy's name was now seen not as an asset but a liability. Despite all this, Diddy still had defenders. Some former collaborators stood by him, publicly insisting this was a witch hunt. Few fans protested the media coverage, claiming bias and exaggeration. But the tide had turned for every voice in support. There were thousands calling for accountability. When Diddy finally took the stand, the room felt suffocating. Cameras weren't allowed, but every reporter present described the atmosphere as electric. He denied all allegations. He claimed misunderstandings, insisted he had been mischaracterized, and blamed media manipulation, but his tone faltered at moments. He sounded defiant at others. Cornered, the cross-examination was brutal. The prosecution dissected inconsistencies in his past interviews, questioned the timeline of events, and presented contradictory statements from his own inner circle. By the end of the session, he was visibly exhausted. His hands shook, his voice cracked as the trial entered its final stages. Jane returned to court, not to testify again, but simply to witness. Her presence alone was enough to send a signal she wasn't afraid. She wasn't backing down, and millions were watching with her. The judge announced closing arguments would begin. The following week, both legal teams prepared their final strategies. The media prepared their biggest coverage. Yet the world, it seemed, had stopped spinning just to hear the final words in a story that had started as a courtroom drama and evolved into a cultural moment. What had started with one voice on the stand had grown into a national conversation, one that asked hard questions about power, silence, and justice, and whether or not the jury found Diddy guilty. The court of public opinion had already delivered its own verdict. The story wasn't over. In fact, it was just getting started.
from September 18th of 2023 from Jane and Cabral, because Jane was explaining that an escort was coming over to the hotel, and she didn't like this particular escort, so she ended up sending a message over to Cabral. And we hear about these messages where Jane is saying, hey, you want to come to NYC for a day? And Cabral said, yes, I would love to, love. And then Jane says, okay, let me set it up now. Cabral sent all his information to her, and then Cabral ended up coming to the Trump Hotel for another hotel night. And again, these are messages from 2023, so fairly pretty recently. But as far as just the lead up to it, and Jane was explaining how Cabral landed, they ended up doing a hotel night, even though she didn't want to do a hotel night. And I think what the prosecution there was kind of sprinkling in that this was sex trafficking by fraud, or at least transportation to engage in prostitution, because she is flying out this entertainer, as she calls him, from Atlanta to New York City, and then they do a hotel night, and then they slowly start to get into the text messages from October, later into November. And what happens in November of 2023, as many of us who have been following this case day in and day out know, that is when Cassie dropped her jaw-dropping lawsuit.
Whatever the outcome, this trial has forced a reckoning that can't be undone. It's no longer just about one man's guilt. It's about how long the industry can look. Away, could this be the moment? Everything changes. Hit that like button, subscribe for more deep dives, and tell me in the comments, do you think justice is finally catching up to Hollywood's elite in the end? This trial might not just be about guilt or innocence, it's about who holds power and who finally dares to speak against it as Hollywood watches nervously. The rest of us are left asking, will this change anything? Hit that subscribe button. Share your thoughts in the comments.